So we need to have a little conversation about insertion lace, because as I am sat here working on this Mary Poppins project, which is still very much a ball of a Mary Poppins project, I am working through miles and miles and miles of this insertion lace and just thinking what a satisfying and beautiful and fabulous technique this is, that was rather common throughout many different centuries of history, but that we seem to have let go a bit today. And this is something that I feel like we should bring back, not only for the decorative, pretty floofy purposes, but also because there are some very practical reasons why insertion lace can be added to clothing. So I guess this is a little bit of a lost technique that I kind of want to reintroduce to you, because it is not as difficult as I think we would interpret it to be looking at the images that we see in history. And I think it is sort of the perfect technique to add a little bit of pizzazz to a sewing project, whether it is historical or modern for everyday wear, to dress up a thrift flip if you found something nice at a thrift store. But more practically, insertion lace can actually be a really great way to, if you have thrifted something that is slightly too small, maybe not quite your size, needs a little bit of room in some places, to add that bit of width decoratively so that you don't have to worry about finding the exact same fabric that the garment used initially. Insertion lace is obviously a very common sewing technique that appears quite frequently in the Edwardian period, which is the period that I'm currently working in with this Mary Poppins project, if you are following along with this. But it is a technique that has been around for centuries. Humans have basically been adding strips of decorative stuff to other stuff for hundreds of years. So whether it is strips of lace, as is quite common by the late 19th century, early 20th century Edwardian period, or it is decorative embroidered panels that are inserted between other panels of things, or even insertion stitches, which are decorative stitches that are sort of woven or embroidered, I guess, in between two panels of a garment so that it's sort of free floating. There are, of course, many different methods of doing insertion lace. It develops through history, it develops from person to person, and especially by the early 20th century, we start to get a lot of sewing instruction texts, which of course all tend to instruct completely different methods in some cases. So I will be showing you a couple of different insertion lace techniques in a couple of different circumstances, and of course these are techniques that can be done either by machine or by hand. So you don't need a sewing machine to do this if you do not so desire, or if you do not so have. Sewing machines may make things marginally quicker, although it is quite delicate work, so it is definitely not a super quick and easy thing that you can just speed through a machine, but it does take a little bit of precision work. It's extremely satisfying and the end results are fantastic. 10 out of 10, highly recommend. So let's explore some insertion lace techniques. The first and most straightforward method of lace insertioning is simply to take two separate panels of fabric and stitch lace to either side, connecting the pieces via the lace. This is the method to use if you want to add some width to a garment, since the lace will add that space that the garment wouldn't originally have. So it is likewise necessary to account for this if you're adding insertion lace but don't want that extra width. It'll be necessary to ensure that you subtract the width of the lace from the pattern pieces so that the garment doesn't come out too big. I've opted to use this method for my long skirt panels on this Edwardian lingerie dress I'm working on, because the skirt panels are cut in gores so that they flare a bit, rather than just being one long length of fabric that's gathered or pleated up into the waist. Seams in the skirt were going to be necessary anyway, and it would just be one less step if I didn't have to seam all of the panels together and then add the insertion lace, but just use the lace as the seams in the first place. Many garments, particularly earlier in the 16th through 18th centuries, are actually completely finished off at the edges with a small hand-felt hem before the lace insertion is added, but a lot of the lightweight cotton Edwardian lingerie dresses are just left raw at these edges. The lace is first attached along the stitching line of the fabric, and then that seam allowance is folded back, and another line of stitching is placed just parallel to that original seam to hold the allowance back and out of the way. This technique seems to have worked well enough for the last 100+ years, so I am down to give it a go. Working by machine, it was relatively quick work. Quick work, I should say, in comparison to the hand-stitched option, but there is still a bit of slow precision that needs to be taken with this task, since staying precisely on or next to the lace edges requires a bit of vigilance. A tightly woven fine cotton such as this isn't going to be prone to fraying, as the Edwardians knew, so they could very well get away with these edges unfinished. For your own purposes, you may wish to assess the fraying potential of the fabrics you're working with, because a raw edge left on a volatile fabric will diminish its longevity, and thus a proper finish on that edge will definitely be more worth your while. Fine silks can very nicely be pinked into good behavior, but anything super volatile like loose linens, velvets, silks, etc. may do better with a proper hemming, either by hand or by machine, before beginning with the actual lace bit. A second possibility for insertion lacing for when you have a solid panel of fabric but want to insert a bit of lace down the middle is to do just that. I'm positioning the lace carefully where I want it to be placed on the garment. If your lace or fabric are super slippery, or if you're using a fabric with a very mobile weave such as velvet or organza, you may wish to baste this into place just to keep it super secure exactly where you've placed it. In fact, basting is probably a good idea in all circumstances, but sometimes one is lazy, and I shan't fault you for that. Both edges of the lace are then stitched down on either side so that when we flip the finished piece over to the back, we can cut the underside of the cotton down the middle to expose the lace insertion. Again, if the fabric is super prone to fraying, you may wish to fell or overlock the seam allowance here, depending on how much width you have to do so. But since my cotton here is very stable, I'm just leaving them raw, and once again folding these edges back so that I can secure them with another row of stitching just parallel to that lace edge. This second row of stitching requires much less precision than the first, and honestly, on some extant Edwardian lingerie dresses, it shows. The level of neatness you employ here is entirely up to you, but let it be known, drunk stitching is entirely historically accurate. We can actually get quite fancy with this technique, as the Edwardians especially were fond of doing. Lace can intersect at points, and if you're using Valenciennes lace, the kind that has a straight thread in the edge, you can actually pull this and press it to give it a gentle curve. The possibilities are endless. The design for the sleeves on my gown is replicating the lace arrangement on an extant lingerie gown I studied in my research for this project, and this involves a simple little geometric pattern with some little mitered points. You don't think I wouldn't hand sew at least some of this project, would you? The same procedure as before is followed. The lace is first stitched down at either edge. I'm doing this seam with a running back stitch, or what the late 19th century likes to call a combination stitch, which is basically a running stitch done for speed, but with every second or third stitch taken as a back stitch just for security. With lightweight materials such as these, I'm hesitant to backstitch much since the tension of a strong backstitch can easily overwhelm the delicacy of the fabrics and cause some puckering. But a straight running stitch I think would be a bit too unstable for this, especially since it's a sleeve piece and may experience some vertical strain with bending and extending the elbow. Once again, the underside of this channel is cut open, and once again, that seam allowance is tacked back with a quick stitch just parallel to that lace edge. This one really is mostly a running stitch. I think I only took maybe every 7th or 8th stitch as a back stitch just for safety, but since it's not a seam that actually holds two things together, it didn't have to be the strongest thing in the world, and I opted for speed here. Particularly if you are hand sewing, you'll probably need to give this piece a good press just to sort out any handling creases before it will look satisfactory. So that has been the process of insertion lace, and a process which has been consuming my life profusely for the last few weeks, in the most wonderful way imaginable. The creative possibilities for this really are endless, especially when you start seaming different widths and patterns of lace together to create a completely unique artistic masterpiece of lace paneling to add into any garment. As I was peeking through magazines to work out the design for my own gown, I realized there are just so many beautiful patterns, and this is definitely something I'm going to be doing a lot more of in the future. Insertion lace is much like techniques such as beading and embroidery, functionally superfluous and not strictly necessary to the actual construction of a garment, but an absolutely beautiful addition to the style and decoration of a garment that is absolutely, I think, worth the time and effort. I know we crafters tend to like to have something in our hands whilst doing other things or whilst consuming entertainment. So if you are looking for some appropriately historically transporting new shows to watch, I highly recommend those offered by our sponsor for today's video, Acorn TV. Acorn TV is a streaming service specializing in British, Irish, and Australian TV dramas and documentaries. It features thousands of hours of binge-worthy content, including classics like Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries and Murdoch Mysteries, as well as an amazing selection of historically focused documentaries, period dramas, and like every flavor of mystery and crime drama imaginable. That's like hundreds of lace insertion projects worth of content for you to enjoy. Recently, I've been really enjoying the Acorn TV original called Dead Still, which is a sort of comedic murder mystery following an Irish post-mortem photographer who ends up helping to investigate some murders in the circa end of the 19th century, vaguely. Definitely recommend. You too can enjoy some of this delicious crafting accompaniment commercial-free for $5.99 a month via any of those TV apps, or if you are a millennial or a Victorian like me and you don't understand TVs, you can also enjoy streaming online too. Try Acorn TV free for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and using promo code Bernadette. Happy watching!